Senior Editor of Multi-Platform News at WBEZ Chicago Public Media. Yeah, it's kind of a big deal. I was just talking to Tricia. It's actually more than kind of a big deal. It's a big deal. She also is the podcast of a popular, the host of a popular podcast called Nerdette. But important to me and a lot of people on this staff, she's a MIPA kid. She's not a kid anymore, but she grew up in MIPA. She's been to MIPA camp, and she worked for us for many years. So Tricia's come home, conquering hero, and I'm excited to hear what she has to say about media.
So about 5 years ago, I started with my co-host Greta. 5 years ago, we met up for brunch. We were talking about all the podcasts we listened to. We like nerdy stuff, and we ticked down a list of all the things we listened to and realized they were all hosted by dudes. And thought, well, maybe there's an opportunity for us to have a voice in this space. Maybe there's something missing from this space if that's the way that the landscape looks. At the time, only 10 of the top 100 podcasts in the Apple Store had a woman as a host or a co-host. That number has jumped up a little bit. I don't think it's broken 20 yet though. So there's still a lot of disparity in what is a pretty democratic area of media, which is anybody can make a podcast, anybody can submit it to the store, but we still see some disparities there. So we decided to have some fun and built a show over the last 5 years where we get to do things like talk to Tom Hanks about typewriters. He's really into typewriters. And what we realized by just doing it, starting 5 years ago, is that people were hungry for conversations, but also a community. And so a lot of what Nerdette has become is really not just a half-hour weekly show where we sit down and talk to somebody. That's still the core of what we do. But it even spun out into things like us recapping Game of Thrones with Peter Sagal. But this is something that I was sort of always doing in addition to my day job at WBEZ. It was something that started completely off the clock, a passion project. Nobody asked Greta and I to do this. We just wanted there to be something in the world that felt like us, that felt like a place where we could be ourselves, that involved us getting to ask questions that we didn't hear other people asking when they interviewed some of these same folks. And so my advice to you is if you have that idea in your head of something that just you don't see out there, make it. Go make it. Don't wait for somebody to tell you to make it, because they might never do that. But it turns out if you put the time and energy into it, not only will you get the satisfaction of learning as you go, but people will sort of form around you a community that you can then build on and make something that 5 years later involves Tom Hanks sitting down to talk about typewriters. Don't try to do this alone. I think a lot of times we think that our passion project has to be sort of solitary, but for the kind of work that we do, more people is better. Another set of eyes is better. An editor is always better than you on your own. And life is better with a co-host. And so for a long time it was just Greta and me trying to make this show every week on top of our jobs. As it started to gain some steam and momentum, we got to build a team around it, and so we now have an executive producer who works on the show, we have a producer who works on the show with us, and we're getting to go places that we wouldn't have gotten to go otherwise. And the one that you'll hear coming up if you go ahead and subscribe to the show, if you want, there's like 200 episodes of going back if you want to just cherry pick for people whose names you recognize and listen to some of those conversations. Our job is to ask questions and listen with integrity, and I think that integrity piece is something that is really important because all of you right now are representing your schools here. You'll go back home, and then when you're working in your school publications, you're representing all of us. You're representing journalists everywhere. Every time you step out to do an interview, every time you sit down to write a story or take a photo, the way you do that work reflects on all of us. This is a quote from one of my favorite journalists. Her name is Brooke Gladstone. She hosts a show called On the Media from WNYC. And I just like this because it acknowledges that sometimes even somebody like Brooke, who's been doing this for 30 years, sometimes can be afraid to ask questions because they're awkward, because they're personal. But if you know that feeling when you go to interview somebody, that adrenaline of wanting to ask them, it's because asking hard questions makes you feel like you're doing your job. And then I like that after, she says, it's you doing your job as long as the stakes justify asking these questions. Questions are the heart of engagement. You need to ask them. You need to ask them of yourselves, you need to ask them of your community. That engagement is going to earn you trust. That trust is then going to define a relationship, right? Trust defines every relationship you have with your parents, with a significant other, with your siblings, with your friends. If they never ask you about your life, if they never ask you questions, if they don't know you, do you really trust them? And those relationships that are built on trust, they have a value, right? Like that is where you get some value from it. That is where you place importance. And that value, if we want to be journalists who can get paid to do this work, that value that we provide is what's going to be economically sustainable for us. Because it's not just about sort of the volume of page views, the sort of giant audience that we're trying to capture. We need to have relationships with people, whether that's for a pledge drive down the road, for a subscription model, to make sure that our audience is engaged with us. So when you're doing this in journalism, you can't be afraid to get your hands dirty. As I sort of said on the next slide, sometimes the muckraking part of journalism involves some actual muck. So, one of my favorite examples of this is environmental journalists who, to prove how polluted water was in a river near a photo plant, they went out at night and were able to actually develop photos in the water of the river.
Oh my gosh.
So sometimes you're actually going to get your hands dirty. Sometimes, and probably more often, honestly, what this means is you're going to be wading through tons of data. So this is a quote from a speech that Edward R. Murrow gave in 1958, so a full 60 years ago, where he thought everything was going to hell because of television, which he was on. It's called the Wires and Lights in a Box speech. If you want to look it up, it's a pretty good read. So what he said is there's a great battle to be fought against ignorance, intolerance, and indifference. And that if we don't use these tools we have, whether it's television or radio or whatever we're doing online, if we don't use these tools to combat those three things, then we've missed an opportunity, and it's probably something that journalists need to be not just conscious of, but keep front of mind, front burner. Ignorance, intolerance, indifference. I actually want to add one more to that, and that's isolation. I think more and more right now, we're not just reaching towards storytellers for information in terms of ignorance breaking. We're not just looking for people to make us more tolerant or to care more, but we're also, again, seeking that sense of community. I'm going to quote a pal, Joe Grimm, who I don't think is here this year, but has been a part of MIPA for a long time, who always said to us, if you want to be a surgeon, and you go home and you try to do knee surgery on your little brother, that will be frowned upon. But if you want to be a journalist right now, there's absolutely nothing stopping you. You'll get better at it. You should be open-minded to learning. You should take the advice of all the people in these blue shirts this week who are going to teach you a lot of amazing things, and from each other. There's a ton of knowledge in this room. There's a ton of expertise already in this room.
Give a round of applause for Tricia.